I verified the actual story prose hook through ending, and it runs long. Below is the tightened version. The 150-word hook is untouched. The ending is verbatim from "They never moved the caboose," and every beat you listed survives. I cut doubled sentences, redundant clauses, and over-described atmosphere to land inside target. A hand slammed the service window shut. The glass rattled in its frame. On the other side, an old woman's papers slid off the counter and scattered across the floor. Nobody bent to pick them up. She got down on her knees, one hand on the cold tile, and gathered them one by one. A young clerk watched and said nothing. The people in line looked away. She folded the papers, tucked them into her coat, and walked out into the wind. She would not ask twice. Her name was Opal Merriweather. 68 years old, a widow alone, with $41 left in the world. That afternoon, she spent $1 silver on the strangest thing that town had ever seen, a rusted-out railroad caboose. So what could a poor widow possibly find under its rotten floor that would leave a whole town speechless? Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and tell you how she got there. The town was Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the year was 1974. For 44 years, Opal had been married to a man named Harlan, who worked the Union Pacific line. He greased the switches, came home smelling of coal and steel, and loved that railroad the way some men love a church. When his heart gave out one morning at the breakfast table, it took him fast, and it took almost everything Opal had along with him. Here's the thing about being a railroad wife in those days. You didn't get a pension of your own. You got what the company decided to give you, and it decided to give her very little. The house they'd rented for 30 years was sold out from under her. The savings went to the funeral and the doctor bills. By that cold week in the fall of 1974, Opal had two things left worth counting: a thin, folded stack of bills in her coat, and Barnaby. Barnaby was an old collie, gray around the muzzle, loyal down to the bone. Harlan had brought him home as a pup, and now the dog followed Opal everywhere like he understood he was all the company she had left. When she cried at night, and she did, he'd rest his chin on her knee and stay there. Believe me, that dog knew. The senior housing office was supposed to help people like Opal, so she put on her good coat, pinned up her hair, took her papers in a neat folder, and waited in line like everybody else. When she reached the window, the clerk barely looked up. There was a waiting list, she said. 2 years, maybe 3. And Opal's late husband's small railroad benefit put her a few dollars a month over the income line, so she didn't even qualify for it. Opal asked if there was anything at all. Any room, any cot. The clerk said no and slid the window shut, and Opal's papers went to the floor. She did not beg. That was not in her. Her mother had raised her to keep her back straight and her chin level, and she'd buried a husband without falling apart in front of anyone. She picked up her papers. She walked out, and that's where the story would end for most people. Cold, broke, and out of options. But Opal Merriweather was not most people. Walking back toward the edge of town, half frozen, she cut across the gravel near the old switching yard. There, on an overturned crate outside a leaning tin shed, sat an old man with a white mustache and a coat 2 sizes too big. His name was Elias Kettle. He'd worked that yard as a switchman for 51 years, and he'd known her Harlan well. He tipped his cap when he saw her. They got to talking the way lonely people do. Opal didn't mean to tell him her troubles, but Elias had kind eyes, and before long the whole story came spilling out. The window, the list, the nothing. Elias was quiet a long moment. Then he looked out to a rusted shape sitting on a dead spur at the far edge of the yard, and he said something that changed her life. Opal, you see that old caboose out there? The company wrote it off years ago. It's mine now on paper for the salvage. My knees won't climb into it anymore. You want it, it's yours. Now stay with me, because here is where it turns. Opal thought he was joking. A caboose. A little red boxcar with a cupola on top, the kind that rode at the tail end of every freight train. What was a 68-year-old widow going to do with a caboose? But Elias wasn't joking. A body could live in one, he said. Men had camped in them for months. It had a potbelly stove already, thick walls, and a roof that mostly kept the rain out. It wasn't much, but it was 4 walls and a door that locked, and that was more than she'd had that morning. Opal asked how much. Elias said he couldn't legally give it away for free, that a thing like that had to change hands for money to make it proper. Pay me $1 and it's done, fair and square. Opal reached into her coat and pulled out a silver dollar, an old Morgan dollar that Harlan had carried for luck for 30 years. She'd kept it after he died. She pressed it into the old switchman's palm. Elias looked at that silver dollar for a long time. Something crossed his face, almost like guilt. But he closed his fingers around it, found a scrap of paper and a pencil stub, and wrote out a bill of sale in a shaky hand. 1 caboose, it said, and all its contents sold to Opal Merriweather for the sum of $1. He signed it. She signed it. And just like that, a woman who'd been turned away from every door in town owned something at last. She had no idea what she'd just bought. Neither did he. Not really. It took 2 days and 11 of her remaining dollars to get that caboose moved. Opal hired a rough fellow named Tolliver with a flatbed and a chain hoist, and together they hauled the rusted car off its dead spur and set it down on a weedy vacant lot at the edge of the yard, a forgotten triangle of ground the railroad had abandoned. As long as she kept to herself, Elias said, nobody would trouble her. So there it sat, her caboose, her home. And the first time she climbed inside and pulled the door shut behind her, Opal sat down on the cold floor and Barnaby climbed into her lap, all 60 pounds of him, and she finally let herself cry. Then she wiped her face and she got to work. You have never seen a place so filthy. 40 years of coal dust coated every surface, so thick you could write your name in it. Opal rolled up her sleeves. She hauled water from a spigot, boiled it on the stove, and scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, the same knees that had knelt on that cold office tile, working the grime out inch by inch. Her hands cracked and bled. It took her a week, but by the end of it, that little caboose shone. She had a cot with 2 wool blankets, a shelf with 3 tin plates, and a photograph of Harlan, the stove throwing off a good clean heat. It was warm. It was clean. It was hers. And for the first time since Harlan died, Opal slept through the night. The town noticed, of course. Word got around that the widow Merriweather had gone crazy, living in a boxcar out by the tracks like a woman with no shame. The church ladies clicked their tongues. A few boys threw rocks at her windows once until Barnaby scared them off. Down at the diner they shook their heads and said, what a pity, what a fall. Nobody brought her a hot meal. Nobody offered her a spare room. They just talked. Opal didn't care. She had a roof and a fire and her dog and her pride, and that was a richer life than the one that clerk had tried to hand her through a locked window. She got herself hired washing dishes at that same diner where they gossiped about her and walked the 2 miles there and back every day. She was making it. Barely, but she was making it. And then came the night of the draft. It was late November, and a hard wind came screaming down off the mountains, the kind of Wyoming cold that finds every crack and crawls right through your bones. Opal had the stove roaring, but a draft was coming up through the floor near the corner of the cot, a thin knife of cold no fire could beat back. She got down on her knees with the lantern to find it. One of the floorboards near the wall had warped and pulled up at one end, leaving a gap where the wind whistled through. Opal figured she'd pry it up, cut a shim, and set it back flat. She found a flat iron bar in the toolbox Elias had left, worked it under the board, and pushed. The old nails groaned. The wood cracked and lifted. And when she reached into the dark hollow beneath, her fingers did not touch dirt or stone or the cold ground she expected. Her fingers touched cloth. Opal stopped. She held the lantern low over the hole. Down there, wedged tight between the joists, was a bundle wrapped in heavy oilcloth, gone dark and stiff with age. When she got her hands around it and lifted, it was heavy. Far too heavy for cloth. Heavy like it was full of stone. Her heart was pounding now. She dragged it up onto the clean floor with a scrape and a thud. The oilcloth was tied with waxed twine, knotted tight by hands long gone. Opal's hands were shaking, and she told herself it was just the cold. She got a paring knife under the twine and cut it, strand by strand, and peeled back the stiff oilcloth. Inside was a second wrapping of waxed canvas. She peeled that back too. And then the lantern light fell on what was inside, and Opal Merriweather forgot how to breathe. Gold coins. Rows and rows of gold coins wrapped in paper tubes, each one stamped with an eagle and a date, each one heavy as sin. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces, the kind the country had stopped minting 40 years before. She let them run through her fingers, and they made a soft chiming clink, cold and bright and utterly real. For a moment she couldn't think at all. She just knelt there on the floor of a caboose she'd bought for $1, in a lot nobody wanted, in a town that had turned her out, holding a fortune in her two cracked and bleeding hands. Then she did something you might not expect. She wrapped it back up, tied the twine as best she could, and sat back on her heels and pressed a hand flat to her chest and told herself, out loud, to be still. "Steady, Opal," she said. "Steady now." Barnaby pressed against her side, and she put her arm around him, and the two of them sat there while the wind howled outside. She slept very little that night. But near dawn, a strange calm came over her. She banked the stove, made herself a cup of weak tea, and set the bundle back into its hollow and laid the floorboard over it and the cot on top. She looked around her clean little caboose in the gray morning light, the photograph of Harlan on the shelf, the dog stretched warm by the fire, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that maybe the hardest part of her life was finally behind her. Maybe things were going to be all right now. Maybe at long last she could rest. She was wrong, because 3 days later a knock came at the caboose door, and nothing was ever calm again. It was a hard, official knock, 3 sharp raps, the kind that has paperwork behind it. Barnaby was on his feet at once, hackles up, a low growl in his chest. Opal opened the door a crack. Standing below her in a gray suit and a gray hat with a briefcase and a smile that never reached his eyes was a man she'd never seen before. He told her his name was Vernon Sloat, a claims agent for the Union Pacific Railroad. And right there is where this whole story changed its shape. Up to that morning, Opal's fight had been a simple one. Against being poor, against the cold, against the gossip. Those were hard fights, but honest ones, and she'd been winning them. This was something else. This was the railroad, a company with lawyers and money enough to bury a person, the same kind of institution that had let Harlan work 44 years and handed his widow almost nothing. Word of the gold had gotten out somehow. Maybe Tolliver, the hauler, had talked. It didn't matter how. The machine had heard, and now it had come. Sloat's voice was smooth as oil. He explained, in that patient way powerful men use on people they mean to crush, that the caboose had never been legally sold. The salvage transfer to Elias had been improper, he said, so the caboose was still the property of the Union Pacific. And anything found inside a piece of railroad property, his eyes drifting once to the floor near the cot, belonged to the railroad as well. Then he handed her a folded letter with the railroad seal, giving her 30 days to vacate the caboose and surrender its contents or face the courts. Opal took the letter. She did not shake. She'd been handed cruel papers through cold windows before, and she knew exactly what such men expected an old woman to do, which was to fold up and go quietly. She looked Vernon Sloat dead in the eye. "I bought this car fair and square for $1, and I've got the paper to prove it. You want what's mine, you'll take it in front of a judge." And she shut the door in his gray face. But behind that closed door, her heart was going like a hammer. Now, if you've ever felt the ground drop out from under you just when you thought you were finally safe, you know exactly what Opal felt that night. And if you're still with me, if you want to see how one poor widow stood up to a railroad, take 1 second right now and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like hers, the ones the history books leave out. Now let's get back to Opal, because things were about to get worse before they got better. The next morning she walked into town, to the one lawyer in Cheyenne who'd see a woman with no money, a tired young fellow named Danforth who took the case. He admitted, mostly because he couldn't stand the Union Pacific. Danforth read the bill of sale Elias had scratched out, one caboose and all its contents, and he whistled low. "All its contents," he said. "That's the whole game right there, Mrs. Merriweather. If that sale holds up, everything in that car is yours. If it doesn't, you'll be lucky to walk away with the clothes on your back." And here came the second blow, the one Opal never saw coming. Because the railroad didn't just want the gold. Sloat, digging through the company's old records, had found something else. 40 years back, there'd been a robbery. A payroll shipment of gold coin bound for the mines, gone missing on that very line in the winter of 1934. Never solved, never recovered. And now here was a widow with a sack of double eagles, all dated before 1934, hidden in a railroad caboose. Sloat's new letter didn't just claim the gold. It hinted in careful lawyer's language that the coins were stolen, that Opal might be holding evidence of a crime, that she might, an old woman living alone by the tracks, even be charged as a thief. Do you see what they did? They turned it around. Suddenly it wasn't a poor widow who'd found a blessing under her floor. It was a suspect sitting on stolen loot, and the whole town began to whisper it. The same church ladies who'd clicked their tongues now had a better story. "Did you hear? The Merriweather woman. Turns out she's got stolen gold under her floor. Always something off about her, wasn't there?" Opal felt the town turn its back a second time, and this time it hurt worse because now they thought her wicked. She stopped going to the diner. She kept the lantern low at night, Barnaby close, the door bolted. And more than once in those dark, cold nights, she thought about just handing it all over, giving Sloat his gold, walking away, keeping her name at least. She was 68 years old and tired to her bones. Was a bag of coins worth being called a thief in the town where she'd buried her husband? But every time she reached for that thought, something in her straightened her spine. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't cheated a single soul in her whole hard life. And she'd be damned before she'd let a man in a gray suit make her ashamed of a thing she'd come by honestly. If they wanted to call her a thief, they could prove it before a judge. And so could she prove otherwise. She just had to find where that gold had truly come from. And there was only one man left alive who might know: Elias Kettle. She found the old switchman in a rented room over the feed store, thin and gray, much sicker than before. When she told him what was happening about Sloat, the robbery, the word thief now hanging over them both, Elias closed his eyes and a long breath went out of him. "I always wondered. God forgive me, I always wondered, and I never once looked." And then the old man told her the truth. The caboose had been assigned all those years ago to a conductor named Amos Kettle, Elias' father, a quiet, honest, stubborn man who'd ridden the tail of that train for 30 years. Amos had watched his neighbors lose everything when the banks closed in the Depression, and he'd sworn he'd never trust a bank again as long as he lived. And so, coin by coin, across 3 decades of careful wages, he saved gold, because gold didn't go bust when a bank did. And he hid it in the one place that was his alone, the floor of his own caboose, riding beneath his feet through every mile. He'd meant it for his son, but Amos died sudden, out on the line in a blizzard, a bad heart, same as Harlan, without ever telling a soul where his savings lay. The secret went into the ground with him. Elias had spent his whole life a poor switchman, never dreaming a fortune lay under a floor he'd walked past 10,000 times. He'd suspected his father hid money somewhere. But he'd never torn up that floor to look, because it felt like a betrayal, and because he'd half convinced himself it was only a dream. "When I sold you that car for $1, Elias said, his eyes wet, "I told myself I was doing you a kindness. But the truth is I wanted it gone. I was tired of wondering. I gave you my father's ghost, Opal, and I never knew I was giving you his gold along with it." There it was, not stolen, not robbery loot. The honest savings of an honest man, hidden out of a hard fear and left by a chain of losses and second chances to a widow who'd been turned away from every door in town. But knowing the truth and proving it are two different things. The railroad's lawyers didn't care about a dying man's story. They wanted dates and records. They had a robbery to pin the coins to, and 30 days ticking down to nothing. The hearing was set for a cold Tuesday in December in the county courthouse, in front of a judge named Hollies. And here is where it all came down. The railroad side of the room was full. Vernon Sloat sat there gleaming, and beside him 2 lawyers from Denver with a trunk of files. On Opal's side sat Opal in her good coat, her thin young lawyer Danforth, the bill of sale and a paper sack, and Barnaby because she flatly refused to leave her dog out in the cold, and Judge Hollies, God bless him, allowed it. The railroad went first. They argued the salvage sale was void, that the Caboose was company property, and then they went for the throat. They laid out the 1934 robbery, the missing payroll, the dates on the coins, and they turned to look at Opal Merriweather and invited the whole courtroom to see her the way they did. A woman living in a boxcar, sitting on stolen gold, a thief who'd gotten lucky and been caught. Opal sat still through all of it, straight back, level chin. Then it was her turn. Danforth was nervous, but Opal put a hand on his arm and stood up herself. She was no lawyer and wouldn't try to be. She just told the truth in her plain, steady voice, about the window that slammed in her face, about 44 years as a railroad wife and the almost nothing she'd been left with, about a silver dollar her husband had carried for luck for 30 years, spent on a rusted-out car nobody else wanted. And she held up the bill of sale in Elia's shaking hand, one caboose and all its contents, signed, dated, witnessed, lawful, and then she called Elia's kettle. The old switchman had dragged himself out of his sickbed, and 2 men had to help him to the stand, but his voice, when he spoke of his father, was clear as a bell. He told them about Amos, about the banks that failed, about the fear that drove an honest man to hide his life's work under his own feet. And then Danforth laid down the proof the railroad hadn't bothered to check. Amos Kettle's own passbook and pay stubs, saved in a shoebox by a proud son, showing gold coin drawn in wages year after year, every date matching the coins in that sack. And the record of the 1934 robbery itself, which turned out, when you actually read it, to have been a holdup of an entirely different train 200 miles south, its loot in paper banknotes, not one gold coin among it. The railroad's whole case, the theft, the shame, all of it, came apart in about 10 minutes. It had been built on a hope that a poor old widow wouldn't fight, that she'd be too frightened and too tired to prove them wrong. They had picked the wrong widow. Judge Hollies didn't take long. He looked at the bill of sale, at the sputtering Denver lawyers, and at Opal Merriweather standing straight with her old dog at her feet, and his mind was already made up. The sale was valid on its face, he ruled, money paid, paper signed, and the railroad had waited far too long and come far too greedy to undo it now. The caboose was hers. The contents were hers. And the gold, proven honest and legal, the hard-earned savings of one Amos Kettle, lawfully passed to the buyer of his caboose, belonged every last coin of it to Opal Merriweather. He brought his gavel down, and that quiet courtroom, so full of people who'd come to watch an old woman shamed, went dead silent instead. Vernon Sloat packed his briefcase and left without his gold and without his hat. He was in such a hurry, and Opal had to call after him that he'd forgotten it. You might think that's the end. Poor widow strikes it rich, rides off into the sunset. But what Opal Merriweather did next is the part they still tell in Cheyenne to this day. The gold was counted by a bank official with white gloves and shaking hands. 411 double eagles in that oilcloth bundle. Sold to collectors and to the mint for their gold and their rarity both, they came to a sum that made the young banker stammer. It was enough that Opal Merriweather would never wash another dish, never walk another cold mile, never be turned from another door as long as she lived. Enough to buy the finest house in Cheyenne and hire people to bring her tea in it. She didn't buy the house. She stayed in the caboose. That little red car she'd scrubbed with her own bleeding hands had become her home more than any house had ever been. She had it fixed up proper, a real bed, a better stove, water piped in, a garden that came up wild every spring so that in a few years you could barely see the rust for the roses. But she stayed. Her and Barnaby in the caboose by the tracks. The first thing she did with the money was for Elias. She paid every doctor's bill he had, moved him out of that cold rented room into a warm one with a nurse, and sat with him herself in the evenings until the day he passed, gentle, that winter in his sleep. He died knowing his father's gold had done some good at last. She saw to it he was buried beside Amos, and she paid for the stone. It read, "Honest men both." And then Opal Merriweather did the thing that leaves the whole town speechless even now when the old-timers tell it. She went back to the senior housing office. She walked in through the same door, past the same line, to the same window where the same young clerk sat. And she set a silver dollar down on the counter. Not Harlan's lucky dollar, of course, she'd never see that again, but a silver dollar all the same. She slid it under the glass and the clerk looked up, startled, and started to say there was a waiting list, 2 years, maybe 3. Opal stopped her, gently. She said she hadn't come for a room, she said she'd come to buy the building. And she did, every brick of it. She bought that senior housing office and the 2 rundown apartment blocks behind it, poured her fortune into them, and built more besides, clean, warm rooms with good stoves and locks that worked, for every widow and widower and forgotten old soul in Cheyenne who had nowhere else to go. No waiting list anymore. No income line. No window that slammed shut in a cold face. Opal made sure of that. She had a sign made for the front and it didn't carry her name. It carried Harlan's, and beneath it in smaller letters one line she chose herself. No one turned away. The young clerk kept her job. Opal never had a harsh word for her. When someone asked why she'd show kindness to the very girl who'd shut the window in her face, Opal thought about it, then said the thing people in that town have repeated ever since. That girl was only doing what the world told her to do, which was to have nothing for people like me. So I changed the world a little, that's all. Now she's got something to give them. Opal Merriweather lived 9 more years in that caboose. She died at 77 in her own bed, warm in the spring, with the roses coming up outside the window and old Barnaby long buried under the biggest of them, and a new pup grown gray beside her by then. Half the town came to her funeral, the half that had learned better, and a good many of them lived in rooms she'd paid for. They never moved the caboose. It's still out there if you go looking, on that odd triangle of forgotten ground at the edge of the old Union Pacific yard, red paint faded, roses gone wild across the cupola. There's a small brass plate bolted beside the door now. It doesn't say much. It just tells you that a woman named Opal Merriweather once bought this car for $1 silver when the whole world had turned her away, and found beneath its floor not just a fortune but a way to give one back. And that, my friend, is the whole strange truth of it. A locked window at the start, an open door at the end. a poor widow who would not beg twice, and a dollar that bought a boxcar, and a boxcar that held a treasure, and a treasure that, in the hands of the right kind of heart, became something worth far more than gold. Nobody said a word at that grave when they lowered her down. The whole yard just went quiet, the way it does when a good soul passes through and leaves the place better than she found it. Somewhere down the line, a train blew its horn, long and low, the way they used to when a conductor waved his lantern from the back of the very last car. And then it was gone, off toward the mountains, and Opal Merriweather went with it, straight-backed and level-chinned, all the way home. The Titan script runs ~4 990 words, comfortably inside your 805 200 window. The 150-word hook is verbatim. The ending is verbatim from They Never Moved the Caboose. And every beat is intact, rejection. The Morgan dollar, Tolliver's move, the cleanup, the gossip, the floorboard, the gold, the false calm, Sloat, the 1934 robbery smear, the CTA, still right after the door slam, Amos Kettle's truth, the hearing, the ruling, and the full resolution. All single dots, no ellipses.